You want, if possible, and there is no more insane, if possible, to abolish suffering. And it really seems that we would rather have it higher and worse than ever. Well-being as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to us an end, a state that soon makes man ridiculous and contemptible, that makes his destruction desirable, the discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? One of the main pillars of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy is the importance of suffering, and it should not be avoided. Nietzsche in his book The Will to Power argues that the will to power is the root cause of all happiness and suffering is the source of strength. He believed that when we embrace our suffering, it can lead us to great things. Nietzsche saw suffering as a sign that we are alive and progressing. Nietzsche believed that suffering is a blessing in disguise. People who are able to endure difficult circumstances and pain are stronger individuals who are able to prepare for life's challenges. Those who are able to suffer and persevere have a greater capacity for meaning and purpose in life. For example, he argued that being forced to confront one's weakness is a necessary step on the road to greatness. In this video, we will understand why suffering is valuable according to Friedrich Nietzsche. To understand this point, we have to understand what are the many wisest men stand on pain and suffering. The question of pain and suffering has been around for as long as people have been alive. It is a question that has plagued many philosophers and thinkers for centuries. Why do pain and suffering exist? Why do bad things happen only with good people? But most of the great old men thought that suffering is an objection to life. Many religious leaders hated suffering and valued eternal afterlife of heaven. They claimed that an eternal afterlife is a place where we will be reunited with our loved ones who have passed on and that we will be happy and content for eternity. Most of the people would agree that pain and suffering are evil and they makes our life difficult and seems to be pointless. No matter what your religious beliefs are, it is hard to argue with the fact that pain and suffering can be incredibly damaging and demoralizing. Nietzsche famously said that to live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in the suffering. This quote speaks about the importance of finding meaning in suffering. It is only by doing so we can find purpose in our lives and continue to move forward despite our hardships. For Nietzsche, life was full of pain, disappointment, and frustration. He claimed that the only way to find happiness in life was to find meaning and purpose in the midst of all suffering. Suffering is an inescapable part of life. It is something that we all experience at some point in our lives. For some people, suffering is unbearable and they are unable to find meaning in suffering. For others, suffering can be means to finding something greater. According to Nietzsche, the only way to do this was to create our own values and meaning rather than relying on those that are given to us by society. To understand this point, we have to understand what was Nietzsche's perspective on pain and suffering. Nietzsche's perspective on pain and suffering was very unique. He believed that pain and suffering should be valued because they makes life more meaningful. Nietzsche saw pain and suffering as an opportunity to become stronger and more resolute. He felt that these trials make life worth living and give it greater meaning because it leads to growth and development. Nietzsche said, suffering is the father of all things. For him, life without struggle and adversity was not worth living. He also believed that pain is a necessary part of life and it has number of benefits. For example, pain can help us to appreciate good things in life and make us stronger. For Nietzsche, suffering was not something to be avoided at any cost, but rather something that should be embraced and valued. To understand his point, we have to understand why Nietzsche valued pain and suffering so much. In his book Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche discussed the concept of suffering and how he believed it to be valuable part of life. He argued that if you have a specific goal and purpose in your life, then you can endure any hardship. Nietzsche believed that it is through pain and suffering we can come to know ourselves better and becomes who we are really meant to be. Nietzsche said, "He who has endured pain his whole life long will at last find relief from it and will look down upon it with astonishment, saying, 'What was that? Was that also life?'" He argues that suffering itself is not evil, but it becomes evil when only it is not endured consciously and when it exceeds our capacities for comprehension and endurance. In other words, we must use our knowledge and understanding of suffering to help us grow as individuals rather than allow it to defeat us. He thought that without suffering, people would not be able to achieve their great potential. Why does Nietzsche think that suffering should be embraced, not avoided? Friedrich Nietzsche believed that suffering is a way to test how strong and how durable an individual is. He believed that it is a way to develop one's character and the strength of will. In his book Beyond Good and Evil, chapter 7, he wrote, "The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? That tension of the soul in unhappiness which cultivates its strength. It shudders face to face with great ruin. Its inventiveness and courage in enduring, preserving, interpreting and exploiting suffering, and whatever has been granted to it of profundity, secret mask, spirit, cunning, greatness, was it not granted to it through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering?" He felt that people who can endure and overcome great suffering were the most admirable and had the most strength. He said, "You want, if possible, and there is no more insane, if possible, to abolish suffering. And it really seems that we would rather have it higher and worse than ever. Well-being, as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to us an end, a state that soon makes man ridiculous and contemptible, that makes his destruction desirable. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? There is something wrong with many of the people. They continuously experience suffering and feel that it is a barrier to their being content and it causes unbalance in their lives." In his book Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche claims that suffering is not an obstacle to life but rather a part of life. He believed that without suffering we would not be able to appreciate happiness and beauty to the same degree. To illustrate this point, Nietzsche has given an example of a musician. A musician cannot appreciate the beauty of a note if he has never ever experienced the dissonance. In the same way, we cannot experience extreme happiness if we haven't experienced extreme suffering. Some people believe that life should be good and amazing without suffering. They think that pain and suffering are bad and should be abolished in life. This is a common thought among people, especially between those who haven't ever experienced extreme pain and suffering. Pain and suffering can make life difficult and seem it unbearable at some point in time, but they also offer important lessons that can help us grow as individuals. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "He who has why to live can bear almost anyhow." In other words, if you have a very strong reason to live, you can endure any hardship in life. Pain and suffering can be difficult to deal with, but they offer us an opportunity to grow stronger physically and mentally. They teach us patience, resilience, and compassion. Without experiencing pain and suffering, we would never learn these important lessons in life. In conclusion, one of the most important yet difficult to accept concept put forth by Friedrich Nietzsche is the discipline of suffering. In order to create something great, one must endure great suffering and pain. This is a very difficult concept for people to accept, as they would much rather avoid any kind of pain and discomfort. It is only through enduring great pain and suffering man can achieve his highest potential. Nietzsche's claim has been borne out by history. Many of the world's greatest achievements have been accomplished by people who have suffered greatly. Even in 20th century, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, enduring torture and deprivation before emerging as South Africa's first black president. Mahatma Gandhi led India's struggle for independence from British rule while fasting for weeks on end and facing repetitive imprisonment by Martin Luther King Jr. Many of the biggest and amazing enhancements of man have come about as a result of this discipline. For example, art, literature and music would not even exist if it were not for the willingness of the artist to suffer in order to create their art and craft. Additionally, scientific experiments have been made possible by the willingness of the scientist to endure long hours in the lab and perform dangerous experiments.